Hi, I'm Ann McGuire. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land upon which we are gathering, the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, and to pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. In this lecture, I want to share some of the understandings about genre I have gained from my years of being an examiner and a marker for Year 12 English. I hope they will help you as you prepare for this year's exam. I will be looking at a range of genres in different media, including films and memes, because I enjoy these and they help me to think about genre in ways that are relevant to our current context. The lecture is in 3 sections to explore the activities relevant to the 3 sections of the English exam. 1, comprehending, identifying what genre is and how it works in the construction of texts. 2, responding, analyzing generic conventions like those in your studied texts. And 3, composing, explaining how generic conventions can be used to construct a new text. It may be helpful to remember that examiners are stressed too. Examiners have to come up with new versions of the same basic questions year after year. Why? Because they have to base the questions on key concepts in the course. Genre is a key concept on the English course. The exam is meant to give all the students who have engaged with the course the opportunity to show what they have learned. Here is a selection of questions from recent past exams to show you that genre is definitely going to appear in the paper this year. 2016, question 9. Explain how at least one text has transformed or adapted genre to alter an audience's attitude towards an issue or concept. 2020, question 9. Explain how at least one text conforms to generic conventions while still challenging its audience. 2016, question 7. Account for the differences in the way 2 texts use generic conventions by considering their contexts. And 2018, question 5 read, compare how 2 texts of different genres respond to the concerns of the same time period. So genre is going to be there, whether we like it or not. Given that the concept is central to the course, it's pretty important to start by defining it. The English syllabus defines genre as the categories into which texts are grouped. These categories are named when similar, recurring conventions of form or content are noted. For example, fantasy fiction is a popular and familiar genre or category of imaginative text that is found in different media, book, film, television. The Harry Potter novels, the films made from the Lord of the Rings novels, and the television series adapted from the Game of Thrones novels all share the generic conventions of the genre of fantasy fiction. So, remembering then that genre is the categories into which texts are grouped, the key word in the definition is categories. Genre is about grouping texts which are similar in some way. Recurrent patterns of representation, conventions, are noted in a number of texts, and the texts are then grouped as a genre. Genre categories only emerge after a number of texts have been identified as sharing conventions, and texts are thus grouped and can be studied in relation to each other. Let's explore that idea by identifying some of the recurring conventions that we see at work in fantasy texts. The representation of magical events, or the operation of the supernatural, realist cause and effect, whether in a novel, a poem, non-realist cause and effect, whether in a novel, a poem, a play, or a computer game. Think of Game of Thrones, dragons, magic. The trading of characters as other than human. Hobbits, wizard, elves, in Lord of the Rings, White Walkers in Game of Thrones. And another convention, the construction of a setting which is not identical with the real world, but has enough elements similar to our own to be recognizable. Harry Potter and the boarding school. Note that in this slide I have bolded the kind of course-specific language that exam markers are looking for in your answers. Representation, traiting, construction are keywords, not these texts describe weird characters or stuff happens in strange settings. This image is a meme. It's really interesting to me to see that new genres emerge in new contexts. A meme is a constructed text that spreads rapidly through the internet. It combines images familiar to a specific audience with words and/or sounds in a way that is usually humorous. These conventions recur across instances, and readers and viewers expect them and can play with them to make new ones. Look at this meme. For an audience familiar with what George R.R. Martin, the author of the Game of Thrones series of novels, looks like, and familiar with the showrunners of the television series of Game of Thrones, David Benioff and D.B. Weiss, and aware that the Rubik's Cube is a complex puzzle, the meme is readable as a criticism of the TV series. It implies that the TV show is crude and oversimple, like painting the sides of the cube all one color, rather than moving the parts to solve the puzzle. Its meaning is dense, and it needs a lot of reader knowledge to decode it, a bit like a poem. Let's now look at where genre fits with what you have been learning in Year 12 English. Your teachers have introduced you to a range of texts of various types. Imaginative texts, whose primary purpose is to entertain and provoke thought through imaginative use of literary elements. Interpretive texts, whose primary purpose is to explain and interpret personalities, events, ideas, or concepts. Persuasive texts, whose primary purpose is to put forward a point of view and persuade a reader, viewer, or listener. And each text type includes specific genres or categories. Here we see that we have the text type imaginative, which includes prose, novels, stories, traditional tales, poetry, plays, cartoons, and memes. Interpretive texts, autobiographies, biographies, memoirs, media feature articles, and documentaries in the medium of film. And persuasive text types, advertisements, debates, arguments, essays, articles. Now, these can be conventions of form or structure, like the meme, which has the same structure with different content, or they can be of subject matter, across forms, romantic poems, romantic novels. Prose and prose texts, whether fiction or non-fiction, use language, often metonymically, to construct a sense of people, characters, places, settings, and events, plot, as well as a perspective on them. Poetry. Poems use language more figuratively or metaphorically. They construct patterns of sounds and images in a condensed, distilled way to convey meaning. And drama, where productions of plays use language, dialogue, and physical action, as well as costumes, settings, and other visual cues to position viewers. So the conventions of subject matter are things like detective novels or short stories or plays about detection. They share the recurring features or conventions of the genre. The kinds of characters are criminal, victim, detective. The plot is crime revealed and criminal punished. And the theme or ideological focus is the identification of evil in relation to good. Similarly, the convention of subject matter for the romantic novel or poem or play has young characters, a plot involving meeting, difficulties and complications, and then reuniting of the couple. For example, here are some genres, or you could call them subgenres of prose fiction, imaginative texts. Let's pause for a moment and think about what we've covered so far. Because once you know and understand the categories of genres and of genres of text you have studied and their conventions, you have some of the raw material for an exam answer. So think about it for a moment. Can you identify the genres of the text you have studied and their key generic conventions? Try filling in the grid on the next slide and pause the video while you complete the activity. Now I'm going to move on to the notion of representation in my lecture. Let's think about genre as a kind of representation. This is a key word on your English course. So let's start with a clear definition from the syllabus. Representation refers to the way people, events, issues, or subjects are presented in a text. The term implies that texts are not mirrors of the real world. They are constructions of reality. These constructions are partially shaped through the writer's use of conventions and techniques, such as genre, and that comes directly from your English syllabus and its glossary. That means you will never see questions like these. Question 1. Write down everything that happens in a text you have studied in order. Or this, question 2. Read this text you have never seen before and describe what the text says. Why not? Because the English course requires that you explain the way language conventions, such as genres, mediate reality and position readers in relation to the what they convey. You have to discuss not just what is represented, but how. But I've marked an awful lot of exams in which the candidates acted as if those were the questions. You won't do that. Now I'd like to explore what the English course wants you to understand about genre and representation. Here is a question from the comprehending section of the 2016 sample English exam. And you're seeing a magazine cover. Identify at least one visual feature and at least one written language technique in this text, and explain how they construct this magazine's representation of family. Note, the question does not say, describe this picture. So let's start with a basic question. What is the relationship of the people in the image to each other? Answer, it's a family. Well, how do you know that? Well, duh, a woman and a man and 2 kids. This is the response of someone who doesn't understand genre and who hasn't done the English course. Because here is an image which also includes a woman, a man, and 2 children. But what happens if we change an element in the signifier, the image? Let's see if the signified or the meaning changes. The objects represented, an adult male and an adult female, and 2 children, remain the same. But a change in the elements of setting, pose, and proxemics in the construction of the image produces a different meaning of the objects represented. Now we see teacher, parent, child, and student, because the setting has changed. We have seen a classroom setting with a whiteboard and not a family portrait anymore. Here is a family portrait constructed in the way the image is constructed in the magazine cover. The individuals are represented close together, even touching, that's your proxemics. Individuals are represented facing the camera, that's the pose, and looking happy, except maybe the baby. Individuals are represented in a domestic setting. So we can think of the generic conventions as the rules of construction of the text. Now I'm going to have a little think with you about ideas of language. This slide indicates a more traditional view of language, which sees it as recording the world. This model implies that the text producer looks at the world and transcribes the world into the text, so that the text reader or viewer can see the world presented in the text as it is, or at least as the personal and true vision afforded by artists. But, as this more current model implies, it's not that simple. Language and meaning are cultural. We learn language and genre as we learn the world. In the constructionist model, the producer of the text looks at the world through genre and language and reproduces the world that way, and the text consumer reads through language and genre. If we then look again at the image and the exam question, we can see how useful words like genre and generic conventions can be in helping to frame the response. The central visual image is constructed according to the generic conventions of the family portrait, in order to represent the ideal happy family of country battlers posed against a rural landscape. As well, the wording might indicate some ideas about what the image is telling you. At this point in the lecture, you might pause the video and spend a few minutes drafting some sentences that explain how the family portrait is constructed to produce meaning for the reader of the magazine cover. Be sure when you do this activity to use the words genre and generic conventions in your answer. And ask yourself, do any of the words on the cover reinforce that meaning? Can you write some sentences about the way the words and the image work together? Because writing is the best way to be sure you have understood something. So, generic conventions are recurrent patterns of representation. Now let's look at a print text which is constructed according to the very strict rules of the limerick. One Saturday morning at 3, a cheesemonger's shop in Paris collapsed to the ground with a thunderous sound, leaving only a pile of debris. Now, our reading of this text, focusing on genre, would focus on how meaning is produced. Here is a sample topic sentence that would express the point clearly. The generic conventions of the limerick, rhyme, rhythm, line length, position the reader to find the situation amusing because they set up a joke with a punchline and construct a cheerful beat. Notice that this topic sentence doesn't just tell you what happens in the poem, it analyzes the way meaning is made by the generic conventions. It explains what the generic conventions are and the way they work, to position the reader to respond to their content. Now, if we play with changing the text as we did with the family photo and turned it into a schoolroom picture, let's try changing the limerick into a news item. Paris cheese factory implodes. On Saturday morning, the fromage building in the Rue Morgue collapsed. Only the Brie varieties were saved. How have the generic conventions representing the event, the what, changed? Well, the use of the heading and the prose form are conventions of the genre of the news item. What is the effect on the position of the reader positioning? Well, the reader no longer finds the event amusing. It's quite sad now, all that cheese. Once readers have a shared expectation of generic conventions and how they are meant to respond to them, text producers can play with conventions, challenging or subverting them. And here are a couple of examples. A crafty young bard named McMahon, whose poetry never would scan, once said with a pause, "It's probably because I'm always trying to cram as many additional syllables into the last line as I possibly can." Or, there was a young man from Peru whose limerick stopped at line 2. Both of these non-limericks have the effect of making the reader more aware of how the original conventions work. Now, I like this quotation from Steve Neal's book. It doesn't just apply to film, but to genre in general. Genre is best understood as a process in which the repertoire of generic conventions available at any time is always in play rather than being replayed. And that's from his book Genre and Hollywood. This simply means that once the conventions are in circulation, they're available to be worked with, mixed together as in Star Wars, or changed in various ways. Now let's move on to another key concept in the English course, context and its relationship to genre. This is the part of the course I really enjoy. The glossary defines context as the environment in which a text is responded to or created. Context can include the general social, historical, cultural conditions in which a text is responded to and created, the context of culture, or the specific features of its immediate environment, context of situation, and again, that's from the English glossary. What makes the concept of context so interesting is that it helps us to understand why genres emerge and then evolve in specific ways. Science fiction emerged as an identifiable genre in the late 19th and early 20th century. The generic conventions developed in response to a new context in which science became the dominant way of understanding the world. Readers were increasingly working in the disciplines and professions of scientific research and wanted to read stories they found relatable. And then later, as the context changed and many of the scientific elements changed rapidly, writers extrapolated from the present into the future and imagined new forms. So here's a typical question linking genre to context. This is from the Sample English exam of 2016, the responding section. Question 7. Account for the differences in the way two texts use generic conventions by considering their context. So now we link genre with context. And the next 2 slides will explore that idea. The comic book figure of Superman emerged in 1938, but through the 1939 and the 1940s and 50s became hugely popular. The historical context is World War II, and the generic conventions are that the hero possesses strengthening superpowers, he is morally straightforward, the hero's identity is marked by a costume change from business suit to cape and tights. We might think of men moving into uniform during the war. There is a villain who is clearly evil and opposes the hero, think Hitler. The hero's mission is good versus evil. But when we get to the Marvel Universe, with the Spider-Man comic emerging in 1962 and the great Marvel films of 2002 to 2014, which deal with Spider-Man, and of course more recent ones like Thor, more complex issues in a globally connected world change the generic conventions. Now the hero has real human problems. Superpowers are a burden, accidentally developed. In the later Marvels, the hero's stories are linked. And there's humor and irony in the dialogue. Think of Thor. The characters are self-aware. And can you see how the differences between the way generic conventions of plot and character in the superhero genre can be explained by their different historical contexts? Recently, I've become very interested in a new genre of subject matter that has emerged in movies. 2 of these movies are screening in Perth as I am preparing this lecture, so I had an excuse to go and see them, and the other one I saw in 2019. These films have a great deal in common, as many reviewers are currently noticing. They seek to explain bad behavior of a villain by providing a personal history or backstory. So in 2019 to 2021, we see the villain backstory emerge, because now we're more interested in understanding the reasons behind the behavior of others and not just booing and hissing them. I am going to discuss Cruella in relation to this exam question. English Exam 2016, Responding Section, Question 9. Explain how at least one text has transformed or adapted genre to alter an audience attitude towards an issue or concept. Well, Cruella is interesting because its intertexts were originally produced for children. In Dodie Smith's 1956 novel, The 101 Dalmatians, And in Disney's 1961 cartoon, 101 Dalmatians, the baddie is Cruella de Vil, Cruella Devil, an aging woman who wants a coat made of Dalmatian fur and kidnaps puppies to achieve her goal. She is bad and the dogs are good. It's that simple. But in 2021, the commercial context allowed the Disney franchise to remake earlier texts for which they own the copyright. So now we get Cruella, which doesn't much resemble the original cartoon or the novel. Cruella does, however, adapt genre to alter the viewer's attitudes toward the concept of the female villain. In Cruella, the genre shifts from children's novel to hip teen heist movie with a villain backstory. The plot, spoiler alert, Estella is a wild child who tries to conform but is expelled from school. As her hair indicates, she's really Cruella. Her mother dies, pursued by vicious Dalmatians controlled by an Anna Wintour figure, an aging fashion designer. After drinking a flask of brandy, Estella, now a young adult, creates a Vivienne Westwood 1980s punk-style gown and comes to rival the older woman in fame. Embracing her true nature as a bad girl, Cruella carries off the central action plot of the heist. But the plot structure is really the Bildungsroman, the growing up story with a dark twist. And growing up for Cruella involves understanding that her evil nature is genetic. It's her real mother's fault. Her real mother is the fashion designer. The good mother is the stepmother. And it's fun being bad. Oh, and she has a cute dog she adores. So she's a dog-loving villain. With an intended audience of young adults and adults, the generic convention of the character of the baddie shifts to construct a more complex, problematic figure. But spoiler alert again, there is still a clear-cut baddie in the figure of Cruella's real mother, while her stepmother is the goodie. Now, let's move to another aspect of the English exam that students find the most stressful of all. This is the comprehending section, where the text is in the form of a block of prose print you've never seen before. And I think of it a bit like walking into a dark wood with no markers and no guidelines. This is what you would see if you turned over your exam paper. A space odyssey at 8. And they will give you the information about genre in the question. This is an extract from a book of essays which draw on the genre of the memoir. On a winter's day in 1969, our teacher wheeled a television into the classroom. The grade 4s, she said, were about to witness a moment of history, though for us the mere presence of a telly at school was landmark. She was an intense young woman from the English Midlands who wore Dr. Scholl's clogs and seemed to suffer a permanent case of the sniffles. That day she seemed particularly agitated. The set hummed and flickered as she struggled to get a signal. Some wag asked if we could watch Marine Boy or the Flintstones. Eventually, she found the broadcast channel and we settled and fell silent as Neil Armstrong tipped himself back off the ladder to walk upon the moon. The black and white transmission was woolly, the commentary terse, and there was no grand music to accompany the events before us. Without the misty look in the teacher's eye, we might have missed the momentousness of the occasion. But in the street that evening, there was no mistaking the importance of what had occurred. The adults of the neighborhood were fizzing with pride and excitement, and on TV, the pundits suggested that humans had finally broken free of earthly restraint. The future lay close and undefended before us. We were on our way to the stars. Now, for me, knowing a little bit about generic conventions is a bit like walking onto a road with lots of signposts. The generic conventions of the memoir are memorable episodes from a real person's life, tick. First-person point of view, tick. Real places and events, tick. Privileging of author's experience, tick. Sense of nostalgia looking back at the past, and a sense of sharing a meaningful anecdote with the reader, Tick. So here is the passage again, but this time I have bolded some of the words and phrases that are generic markers. This is a good exam technique for you. Underline anything that looks like a generic convention so that you can identify the possibilities of a generic analysis. Finally, the composing section of the exam, which often causes difficulties for students. Question 13 on a past exam read, create an imaginative text in a particular genre, but with an atypical setting. Your ability to respond effectively to a question like this requires that you understand typical generic conventions and how they work. Atypical means not typical. That is why your teacher has chosen a range of texts that employ a range of conventions. Not just so that you have done those texts, but so that as a text producer, you can put genre to work to make meaning. For example, a science fiction text would be set in the future on another planet. So in order to make it atypical and change the temporal time setting, yours could be set in the past. In order to change the spatial or place setting, it could be set on Earth. You have to know the typical convention to change it. Don't ever forget that your text needs a title that indicates you know the genre. The title of this one might have been Back to the Future. Finally, do you know the genre of each of the texts you've studied? Can you identify the generic conventions of their form and content? Do you know how those conventions work to position the reader in relation to what they represent? Do you understand the ways in which their context of production and consumption is relevant to the choice of genre and the way it is used? Let me end by wishing you good luck. But if you know all those things, and if you study, you won't need it. Thank you.